Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome everyone who's on this call to this first, what I call historic webinar that the Coalition of Schools Educating Boys of Color is hosting today. This gives us a real important opportunity to talk about the unintended consequences of harsh discipline. So we're very excited as an organization to be able to sponsor this first webinar in what will be a series of webinars. The Coalition of Schools Educating Boys of Color is an organization that's dedicated to the inspiration, the support, the strengthening of school leaders who are determined to address the social, emotional, and academic success of boys and young men of color. We are very, very proud of our efforts so far, and we're excited that all of you educators and community folks are on the call with us. I would want to encourage you, I would be remiss if I didn't, to say that we have a campaign for membership. And if you go to cosbach.org/membership, you can learn more about the benefits of our organization. We have several categories that I encourage you to review closely and become a part of a very important movement in this nation. That movement is to reverse the negative trajectory that too many of our boys are on and to turn them into positive outcomes. I want to also inform you that in the future, there'll be webinars. They'll be talking about topics such as early childhood, special education, gifted and talented, all related to the education and affirmative development of boys and young men of color. I also wanted to share with you that as far as the organization goes, we have a couple events that are real important and would like for you to be on alert for email blast or check our website periodically. One is our school awards campaign that's currently in process. We'll be identifying 5 schools across the nation that are exemplifying the success and the promise that can be had when we educate in a positive direction all of our boys and young men. So be on the lookout for those recipients of the awards. Those recipients of the awards, I might add, will also be in attendance at our 7th annual Gathering of Leaders, which will be hosted April 25th through 27th at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Our annual gathering is an experience not to be missed. The theme of the gathering, and you'll note that I don't say conference because the gathering is very different than the usual conference. It's a very special activity that you should consider attending. The theme is Young, Gifted, and Literate, Prepared Boys and Young Men for the 21st Century. And at that gathering, you'll have a chance to see promising practices in action, meet kindred spirits who are working in this field, and you will be amazed about the connections and networking that will be gained. So I'm going to stop now just to encourage you, again, to go to cosbach.org/membership, find out more about the membership benefits that can be yours if you decide to join this movement. And at this time, I'm very pleased to turn over the moderation to a member of our staff, Ms. Rhonda Bryant. Rhonda is the Cosbach Policy Consultant who organized this first webinar, From Rigid to Responsive, Better Approaches to School Discipline. And Rhonda will introduce our guest speakers, and we're so happy to have them with us today. And I'm sure that this is going to be a wonderful, interactive, highly informative learning session. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you, Ron. Welcome, everyone. This is our first in a series of webinars for school leaders that is aimed at addressing the critical policy and practice issues that are affecting boys of color in their schools. Today's topic, school discipline, is one where we see that the data clearly shows that boys of color suffer disproportionately from harsh disciplinary practices, which in turn affects their attachment to school, their achievement in school, and their rates of successful completion or graduation. We know that more responsive approaches that keep students in school and that are sensitive to their social and emotional needs and to culture can make a huge difference. Today, we will hear from Jason Sinocruz, a staff attorney with the Advancement Project in Washington, D.C. Advancement Project is a national organization that works on many issues, one of them being to end the extreme and unfair school discipline measures that push children off of an academic track and onto a track for prison. We will also have a presentation from John Simmons, the Executive Director of Student Services, and Eldridge Greer, the Director of Mental Health and Assessment for Denver Public Schools. Because of the tremendous work happening in Denver, they have made great strides in creating a better approach to school discipline. Following both of these presentations, participants will have an opportunity to ask questions over the phone, and the operator will direct the participants on how to indicate that you have a question. In addition, as our operator already mentioned, you can use the chat feature to send your questions directly to me as the host. We'll take as many questions as possible, but please understand that we may not be able to fit all of our questions into today's webinar. If at any time you're experiencing difficulties, press *0 and the operator will assist you. With that, we will now hear from Jason Sinocruz of Advancement Project. Jason?
Thanks, Rhonda, and thanks to everyone for joining us on this very important conversation, as Ron mentioned. I'll be spending about 20 minutes talking to you today about 5 different things. If we go to the next slide, our agenda for the talk. We'll be talking a little bit about Advancement Project, who we are, what we do, and how it's connected to this work, and then provide a brief background of zero tolerance in the school-to-prison pipeline, looking at it from a national perspective in particular, and looking at its effect on students of color. After that, I'm going to segue into talking about some of Advancement Project's local work and also some national attention, especially this year, and some upcoming exciting opportunities that are happening on this issue. And then I'll end talking about what you all can do, given your role in the schools and as leaders in your communities with this issue. So just a little bit about Advancement Project and who we are, as Rhonda mentioned. We are a racial justice civil rights organization based in Washington, D.C., and we work on many different projects, and one of them is our project called Ending the Schoolhouse to Jailhouse Track. Within that project, our goal is to work with grassroots groups across the country to end the school-to-prison pipeline in their communities. So while we are working in D.C., we are a national group working with different communities across the country on this issue. A secondary goal of ours is to aim to change the national conversation on STPP as you see it there, or the school-to-prison pipeline, and also to provide resources and best practices on school discipline, given our long history of working on this issue across the country in many different places. As I alluded to, we are active in more than a dozen sites, including the list that you see here: New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, and my colleague John Simmons, who you'll be hearing from earlier. We work with folks in Denver and in Colorado on a lot of these issues as well. So going back to sort of next part of what I want to talk about was just to provide a brief background on zero tolerance in the school-to-prison pipeline. Thinking about the origins of the term zero tolerance, really as something that started in the 1980s during the war on drugs and as the government was creating drug policies. And we started to see that term adopted into our schools, particularly in the late 1990s, as one event that happened was Columbine, when we started to see zero tolerance start to come into our schools. As a result of these zero tolerance practices, we started to see student behavior become recharacterized. So instead of something like pushing and shoving, as you'll see in the next slide, students started to be accused of battery. Instead of just swiping headphones, students started to be accused of theft or robbery. And instead of talking back, students started to be called for things like disorderly conduct. So in effect, we started to see kids being punished in schools for being kids. And as a result of that, we've wasted billions and billions of dollars in things that we think about, obviously, such as more metal detectors and surveillance cameras and alternative schools that we've seen throughout the country, but also some longer-term effects, such as lost tax revenue, higher public health costs, higher criminal justice costs, etc., as you see on the slide here. A result of all of these policies has become into what has now become known nationally as the school-to-prison pipeline. And one way that we think of that school-to-prison pipeline in our work is the definition that we provide for you here, which are these are the policies and practices that are directly and indirectly pushing students out of school and on a pathway to prison. So we believe that it is both those practices where students are arrested for minor misbehaviors, like we've seen throughout the last decade, but it's also those practices where we're pushing students, expelling students, suspending students out of school, and having them disengage from the classroom and end up in other types of behaviors, and like we said, on a pathway to prison. Nationally, we've seen that this problem has existed and has started to increase. So starting in the 1990s, as I mentioned, we started to see on the slide black students started to receive more out-of-school suspensions and just suspensions in general. Same with Latino students, and really it has been a very racialized type issue. This next slide is of folks of the issue in Colorado, and which has made a lot of great strides in the past few years, but also noting that the disparities between white students and black students and white students and Latino students and Native students with regard to suspensions, referrals, and arrests that were happening in school. We also saw this issue in Denver, where out of 100 out-of-school suspensions happening, the majority of those happening to black and Latino students on the next slide, whereas white students and Asian Pacific Islanders were less represented on those. The other slide I wanted to talk about was the one here on Florida on who we are arresting. You'll see that on this, that black male youth in particular are more likely to be referred, which is similar to an arrest, for behaviors such as disorderly conduct, assault and battery and trespassing as compared to their white male counterparts, whereas white males were more likely to be referred to Florida police for things like drug laws and alcohol offenses. So these are, if you think about the white male offenses as being more objective crimes where there's an actual crime there, and thinking about the black male youth offenses as being more subjective crimes where they are things like disorderly conduct, which is a term of art and doesn't really mean a specific thing in general. We've also seen nationally that the disparity has increased between black students, Latino students, and white students in the push out from schools, which this slide illustrates, where the rate for white students nationally has decreased, but for black and Latino students has increased. So that's just like a little bit of an overview and background information on zero tolerance in the school-to-prison pipeline and where we are nationally with this work. And I'm going to segue into talking a little bit about my organization's local work and what we've been seeing across the country on this issue. Really what we've seen is that a movement has emerged on this issue. In response to the elimination of these harsh policies and practices, in the response and want to end zero tolerance across the country, we've seen increased parent and student resistance, district reform, which I know my colleague John will be talking about in a little bit, and also we've seen state legislative reform and federal attention. As I mentioned, at Advancement Project, we work with local groups across the country on their issues, and I wanted to highlight 3 of those places and the wonderful work they've done and accomplishments they've had in this regard. So in Chicago, we work with a group called Voices of Youth in Chicago Education, also known as VOICE, and in the last year, VOICE has brought attention to overly punitive disciplinary fines imposed by a specific prominent charter network in Chicago, and has also worked to edit the discipline code in Chicago by reducing the number of days students could be suspended for minor acts and also eliminating automatic 10-day suspensions for the worst offenses. Our partners in Philadelphia in the last few years are Youth United for Change, and they've published a report on zero tolerance within their local schools, and they've also revised the discipline code just this last year to eliminate out-of-school suspensions for unreasonable behaviors and also to add protections for gender expression. One of the partners we've worked with the longest is Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, which is based in Denver, Colorado, which my colleague John is very familiar with. And in the past 5 years, Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, Advancement Project, and Denver Public Schools have done a lot of great work jointly on this issue, specifically rewriting the discipline code and starting a pilot restorative justice program. In May 2012, Padres y Jóvenes Unidos passed a statewide law on smarter school discipline, calling for changes. And also, right now, we're in the process of rewriting the Memorandum of Understanding between police and the district, and also, as I mentioned, aligning using the state law as a way of aligning the discipline code in Denver to even make it even stronger than it is already right now. Some stats from some of the local work that we've done have been very impressive indeed. So in Denver, as I mentioned, 40% decrease in out-of-school suspensions between 07-08 and 2011-12. We specifically look at 07-08 as a year because this was preceding the last sort of large overhaul of the discipline code there, and since then we have seen a large decrease in out-of-school suspensions as a result. Advancement Project has also done work in Baltimore where we saw a 63% decrease in suspensions and a corresponding increase in graduation rates as a result of a new discipline code that we worked on there. And also in Florida, Advancement Project has done work where we've brought referrals down 12,000 in a period of 5 or 6 years, and continuing to do some work there to bring that down even further. So kind of just wanted to bring it back to a couple last things, which is looking at what's been going on nationally in 2012 on this issue and exploring what you all can do in your positions. In the next slide, all of these things here are things that have happened just this year, showing the momentum that's happened on this issue. And I want to highlight a couple of points for you all. Advancement Project has been holding a series of regional action camps, convening 600 grassroots organizations, community members, groups from across the country in 4 different regional sites who have explored this issue, talked about it, and come up with different ideas as to how to tackle it in their communities. Some of you also might have heard of the Department of Justice lawsuit happening in Meridian, Mississippi, where the Department of Justice conducted an investigation and discovered a somewhat literal school-to-prison pipeline happening in that community and bringing a lawsuit because of that. And some of you also might have heard of the Dignity in Schools campaign having a moratorium on out-of-school suspensions, which happened just 2 months ago and was very successful. And the last thing on the slide, actually, I just updated last night for Rhonda, which is that there will be a Senate subcommittee hearing next week on the school-to-prison pipeline, which has been convened by Senator Durbin of the Democrat out of Illinois. So there is a lot of federal and national attention going on with this issue, and that's a very exciting time to be talking about it with you all. And I just wanted to end with just talking about some of the things that you all can do given your positions and the tools that are available to all of you. So first of all, I think a lot of folks just want to learn more about the school-to-prison pipeline and what's out there and whatnot. So at Advancement Project, we do have a digital library which is available on our website with different publications, some targeted toward youth. Some are more white papers. Some, I think, are also targeted towards folks like you all who are administrators in schools trying to work on this issue. On the slide, you'll see a picture of our latest report, which is on bullying and zero tolerance, and trying to explain why zero tolerance is not the best approach for dealing with a bully, but thinking about best practices for that. Advancement Project also has an action kit available on a secondary website we have, which is stopschoolstojails.org. And in that action kit, we have good discipline policy models and also examples of how to collect the data on this issue. As I know you'll hear John talk about in a little bit, data is very important to the work that's being done, and collecting it and reporting it in a disaggregated and thorough way is crucial to understanding what's going on and how best to deal with the concerns that are happening. So really encourage you all to use data to track successes, develop alternative practices, and to really collect it in a great way. The U.S. Department of Education also has a civil rights data collection if you're interested in looking at the information on your district and area and what's been submitted there, and the website is posted here on this slide. One thing to think about is also what the agreement is between your schools and local law enforcement agencies, whether there is one or if there is not one, and whether that's an opportunity to sort of limit the role of police such that they're not over-policing in schools and really focusing on their role and leaving discipline up to schools to deal with. Of course, changing laws, county, state, local, to the extent that you all can, is very important, specifically to reduce the overuse of out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, and arrests. You'll see in the next slide, which is designed to be very overwhelming, that we do have a slide of 25 different alternatives to suspensions, expulsions, and arrests that can be done, which can be as simple as a role play or a loss of privilege, or perhaps having Saturday school, or referring to support staff. So there are many ways to deal with behavior that are more interventionary and appropriate given the situation, and always encouraging districts and folks to think about best practices and how to deal with that. To the extent that you all deal with money, I think money is one way to also work on this issue, and think about, in particular, diverting funding used for law enforcement and security to more preventive and intervention type measures such as restorative justice, and also shoring up support staff such as social workers, school psychologists, and guidance counselors. And last, I want to end with a slide just talking about the importance of listening to community members, parents, and especially youth. And all of the work Advancement Project has done over the last decade on this issue, we found that these voices are often not heard enough in school settings, and that they contain a wealth of information and knowledge that is crucial and vital to fixing this problem in your schools and in your communities. And so we hope that administrators create regular and productive opportunities to engage students, parents, and the community in a dialogue meaningfully about school discipline and thinking about how to include them in that conversation. So about running towards the end of my time, but just wanted to recap and sort of look at how we talked about Advancement Project and what we do, and looked at national data on this issue, how suspensions have been going up, but disparities are increasing among white students and Black and Latino students in particular. We looked at some examples of Advancement Project's local work in Denver, in Florida, in Philadelphia, and in Chicago, and then talked about some national opportunities that are happening on school discipline reform, and I just ran through a series of things that you all can do in your positions to make this better. My contact information is in the last slide. Please visit our website and feel free to contact me. And also, as Rhonda and Ron and the operator mentioned, there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, and I look forward to hearing those from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason, so much for your presentation. We will now hear from John Simmons and Eldridge Greer with the Denver Public Schools.
This is John Simmons, Executive Director of Student Services in Denver Public Schools.
Hello, my name is Eldridge Greer, Director of Mental Health and Assessment Services within the Division of Student Services in Denver Public Schools.
And we will say good morning to you because it is a beautiful sunny morning in Denver, Colorado, and we're speaking to you from the heart of Denver in our Fox Street Administrative Building, looking out at beautiful but not snow-colored mountains in Colorado, unfortunately. So, what we're going to be talking about today is very much in alignment with what Jason was just discussing. And the title of this entire webinar about better approaches to school discipline fits very well with our concept of continuous improvement. We don't pretend that we have found the solution to all of our discipline issues or that we have eliminated disproportionality in Denver. What we are dedicated to is the elimination of disproportionality and to having a more effective system of intervening with student behavior with all of our students. So our presentation is looking at our what we consider our best practices right now, knowing that that concept evolves over time. Next slide. Our goals in this presentation and in this our work together, we'll be talking about our work to reduce the incident rates in discipline for all of our students. We are very clear that that is the way that we're going to eliminate disproportionality, is by recalibrating for all of our students, that we are very clear and intentional about using the word eliminate racial disproportionality. We no longer use language like reducing. We decided there is no acceptable rate of disproportionality in student discipline events. And then, as Jason mentioned, the Smarter School Discipline work that Padres y Jóvenes Unidos was involved in, we refer to that as Senate Bill 46 in our presentation. And much of our work right now is to look at that state statute and to see the many places that our policy and practices align and the few that we need to make some changes in. Next slide. We have much to celebrate in Denver, and I'm sitting here right now looking around at a group of about a dozen student services individuals who are very passionate about this topic of disproportionality, and they're watching this presentation as we present, and are the folks that are on the ground doing the work in the schools to move this initiative forward. So we are very pleased about our significant reductions. We'll show you some numbers around that in our OSS events. We're very pleased about our reduction in expulsion events, and we are exceptionally happy about some changes that we've made to our expulsion process.
This is Eldridge Greer. I just want to highlight the third bullet to give you a little more detail on the increased due process for expulsion hearings. In a few slides, we'll get to the actual data so you can see our reductions in expulsions. But part of the work that we've been able to do is to really eliminate subjective events such as what Jason was speaking to earlier in our expulsion process, so that a student who comes up for an expulsion and has that ultimate consequence is expelled for objective reasons. Over 70% of our expulsions are for weapons and for drug distribution, as opposed to in the past where we would have had a much higher number of students expelled for subjective behaviors such as habitual, disruptive, or disrespectful types of behaviors. We also do a multi-tiered review process so that a number of staff are laying eyes on the information that comes from a school with the request for an expulsion hearing, so that those subjective variables can be ascertained, as well as cases when it goes to an ultimate decision for an expulsion hearing, a good determination can be made on whether the student should actually have to engage in an expulsion hearing. Third and finally, we've significantly increased the due process transparency so that our parents and students, when they have the misfortune of having to go through an expulsion hearing, truly can understand and can meaningfully participate in the process and can express their thoughts and needs about what a student might require to be more successful in school. Finally, we really retooled our expulsion hearing process to utilize expulsion hearing officers that have strong restorative, wraparound service, and social emotional understanding so that the hearings are focused in that framework as opposed to a consequence or punishment-driven or criminal justice-driven model of holding an expulsion hearing. Next slide.
As you can see, we have been able to reduce the number of students who are expelled from Denver Public Schools over the last few years. This is something that, as Dr. Greer mentioned, that has been very purposeful and systematic in our approach to this. We often talk about we don't know if we've hit what the right number of expulsions should be for a district of 84,000 students. We do know that we are pleased that we've moved from a place of subjective reasons for expulsion to more clear and objective reasons, and that the two that jump out in terms of these numbers with drug distribution and dangerous weapons, as we like to say in Denver, it passes our straight face test for events that merit that very extreme consequence. So as we are pleased about driving this number down, we also are very conscious of the fact that, as you'll see later, we have not eliminated our disproportionality within that number. Another piece that we often talk about in Denver, that even if we drive that expulsion number down to 10, if it's a disproportionate number, we will not consider that successful. That whatever the right number would be, whatever that may be, if there is such a thing, our test of success will be that number is proportionate to the number of students disaggregated by race and ethnicity within our district, as we can show you how we look at that a little bit later on in our presentation.
One additional piece to add to that, in Denver Public Schools, we do not expel students out of our district. We expel students from their school setting into other district schools. One piece in terms of our due process that we're especially proud of is that we really work to ensure that any student who is expelled from school is in his or her next school within 3 days of the expulsion hearing. We currently have a rate of over 85% of the students who are re-enrolled into their next school. We also allow students, if they so choose, once the expulsion period has ended, except in very rare circumstances, to either remain in the school that they're serving their expulsion in or to return to their prior school. At the end of the past school year, we had a rate of 100% of students who ended their expulsions in May of this past year being enrolled in school for the beginning of the next school year. So we've really done a strong job of ensuring our wraparound supports are in place to ensure that even when a student needs to be expelled, they're still able, to the best of their ability, to remain on track for academic success, social emotional success, graduation, and post-secondary success. Next slide.
On this slide, you can see clearly, again, a point of pride for us is that we have reduced the overall number of out-of-school suspensions over the last few years. If we were to extend this graph farther back in time, you would see that at one time we had over 12,000 out-of-school suspensions in DPS, and that was at a time when we had more than 10,000 fewer students. So I do want to point out that unlike most urban school districts, Denver is an area of growth, and we have added over 10,000 students in the last 5 years. So we purposely present these numbers as their raw numbers. We could make ourselves look even more favorable if we presented them as percentages of our population because of that rapid population growth. But we're looking at driving down that absolute number. Again, we don't know what the right number is. We don't know if there is such a thing as the right number of out-of-school suspensions. We would rather not suspend any of our students out of school. We would like to keep them in school every day of the year, and that's what we're working toward, is to find the appropriate interventions for those students so that that number continues on this satisfying and dramatic trend downward. Next slide. Now this is the way that we look at our measure of disproportionality, because this is a pie chart that shows us the breakdown of race and ethnicity within Denver Public Schools. And our way of looking at disproportionality is when we graph out our discipline events and we hold it up to this graph of our student distribution, that those two graphs should be the same. And we recognize that right now they're not. That you will see as we go through the next couple of slides, we have disproportionate numbers of African American students in our exclusionary discipline events. We are underrepresented in the number of white students. But this is the measure of how very visually we will know when we've reached our goal of the elimination of disproportionality. That when we take out-of-school suspension, when we look at the students who are expelled and we graph it out this way, that the graphs match. I do want to mention also, for those of you who are not familiar with Denver, that we are a high poverty school district. We have 72.5% of our students on free and reduced lunch. Next slide. Now this is a slide that demonstrates to us our disproportionality and where we need to zero in. As you recall the last slide, we have about 15% of our students are African American students, and we have at this time 32% of our out-of-school suspensions involve African American students. You can see that our Latino students, that we are basically proportionate with their numbers as they occur in our student population, and that our white population of approximately 20% is underrepresented by 8% of those out-of-school suspension events. Next slide. In a similar fashion, although we are so pleased with the reductions in expulsions within Denver Public Schools, we, even with those low numbers, still have disproportionality in those expulsion events, and that you can see it's very similar to out-of-school suspension, with African American students occurring in expulsion events at twice the rate one would expect based on their occurrence within our population, and white students at about half the rate that one would expect based on their occurrence in our population.
This is Eldridge Greer again. To highlight just the challenge that I think most districts across the nation have with disproportionality, that the rate, especially for our African American students, is higher than we would want or expect, despite the fact that we've seen, as John had mentioned, the reduction overall in expulsions, but also the honing of what types of behaviors result in an expulsion. So even with that overwhelming focus on weapons and drug distribution, clearly we see that there are other pieces in our process that need to be addressed to be able to eliminate disproportionality.
Next slide. Now, these are some points that we're reflecting on right now as we look at the data from prior years and as we work with our thought partners in the Advancement Project and Padres y Jóvenes Unidos that, to help us look at where we need to focus going forward. Also, as we work with other divisions and departments within Denver Public Schools, we often say that there is enough of this work for all of us to go around. We need every partner that that has the heart for this work and that is passionate about the elimination of disproportionality. And we recognize that within Student Services we have some unique resources and talents to help with this, but there are people throughout our organization and throughout the city of Denver that are helping us with this work. But the number one lesson that is the hardest one for us to talk about, because it is so emotional for us, but we are so clear about it that even with our dramatic work of moving those rates of out-of-school suspension and expulsion down, that disproportionality has stayed very stubborn for us, and this is our great challenge.
This is Eldridge Greer again, just to dovetail a little bit on what John had mentioned. This is especially challenging for us because within Denver Public Schools, we have in place all of the best practices that national researchers suggest for the elimination of disproportionality. For instance, multi-tiered systems of support, restorative approaches in the vast majority of our schools, bully prevention strategies that are in place, use of cultural pedagogy and de-escalation training strategies for our building teachers. So we continue to look at how do we utilize the best practice supports, but ensure that they're provided and reinforced in ways that will lead to an equitable outcome, especially for our African American students who are still impacted in a disproportionate way in terms of school and classroom removals.
And taking a look at the second bullet, it's become very clear to us that in order to change the school's practices, it's not enough just for a systems change. We're looking at changing beliefs, adding additional skills, in addition to the policy and procedures changes. Both things must happen. And we talk about this really changing people's hearts as well as their minds as they approach this work of student behavior, of asking people to look at it much the same way they would a student who is needing additional help in learning their math facts, that behavior learning is similar to that. It's not an issue of good and evil, crime and punishment, that those notions are out of step, out of date, ineffective. They haven't worked for us. What we're talking about is teaching students, going back to that original idea of discipline as instruction, and giving our educators the tools to support our students through an intervention and instructional approach rather than a punitive approach. On the next bullet point, this is in a district of reasonable size. As I mentioned, we're 84,000 students, 162 schools and counting in Denver. Communication is critical. We have a lot of schools to interact with, a lot of leaders, a lot of changes going on in addition to these discipline changes. We are certainly a school district that's on the move in many areas, so we really recognize that as much as we've tried to build lines of communication, that work probably will never be done. That's a very critical piece for us to focus on. In addition, we've identified our key area of focus for us and support, and that would be our instructional superintendents and our executive directors. And these are titles that we use for our supervisors of schools, and that they have been great allies in this work. For example, by incorporating into their practices a regular examination of this data, of looking at their schools that they supervise, how are they doing, not just academically, but really examining that behavior data and looking at trends over time and examining disproportionality in a way that I can say never occurred in the past with this intensity. We have recognized that the support of our senior leadership in the district is very critical to this. We are very fortunate with the folks that we have leading our district. They are as passionate about this topic as the sincere faces that I have here in the room with me. They, at every opportunity, every speaking engagement, every opportunity that they have to interact with the community and with our school leadership and staff, are very supportive of this work and very supportive of the changes within our discipline policy.
With the final bullet, we realize that we're talking about changing decades, if not a century and a half of practice with regard to student discipline, especially as it relates to certain groups, ethnically and racially. And to make that kind of change so that we can eliminate disproportionality in racial events, it's going to take sustained training, sustained support for our building teachers, our building leaders, and our upper administration, and sustained cooperation with our community stakeholders so that we can really create real structural change in how our students are impacted by their misbehavior when it occurs, but that misbehavior is dealt with, as John had mentioned, in an educative way instead of in a punishment or a fashion that allows for a removal from the educational setting. Next slide.
We have some very specific goals that developed out of those lessons. One piece is that we want to restrict the use of out-of-school suspension to serious and credible threats. And we lifted that language directly from Senate Bill 46 to really highlight the fact that this out-of-school suspension is not something that should be used casually, that this is something that, again, we haven't discovered a way to not use out-of-school suspension yet, but when it is used, we want to make sure that we have a very clear reason for using it and that we've tried other approaches to manage the student behavior before we ever get to that point. So that's language that we're incorporating more and more into our vocabulary as we work with schools around out-of-school suspension.
We're also really focused upon ensuring that our building leaders, in terms of using out-of-school suspension in rare circumstances, are very mindful on the amount of time that a student is away from school. Our proposal is that the use of out-of-school suspension should really be used for planning purposes. When a school has a serious and credible safety risk and there's time that the school needs in concert with the parent and the student to be able to appropriately plan what are the supports that the student needs to be more successful, but also what are the supports that need to be in place to ensure that the school community continues to be a safe environment. Instead of a model of you've done something wrong and we're going to punish you by removing you from school for 5 days.
In addition, being very clear that school disciplinarians have this range of 0 to 3 days. And when we say 0, we mean that as you look at the event, that you might be considering an out-of-school suspension, that you have exhausted all other possibilities, and that truly one of your options is not to suspend that student. In addition, that it is practice that a student may need to have a cooling off period for the remainder of the day, and the out-of-school suspension could be for less than 1 day. So in those rare events when that is the consequence for that student's behavior, that the number of days is really limited, that we don't go to some artificial number like 5 or 10 as we heard from Jason's presentation, but that the disciplinarian is really thinking about, why am I suspending this student out of school? How long is it going to take for us to prepare for the reentry of that student, and that there is no magic in extending that number beyond the bare minimum to take care of those needs.
One piece that we're especially proud, this is Eldridge again, one piece we're especially proud of to help support our building leaders around this is what we call our Alternatives to Suspension document, where we as a district have highlighted all of the discipline events that the district tracks, and instead of focusing on suspension, for the vast majority of those, highlighted the 5 to 7 strategies, preventative and interventionist strategies, that a school should employ to address the student's behavior, so that our building leaders have much more in their toolbox to address student behavior than feeling a need to resort to an out-of-school suspension because of a lack of resource or a lack of expertise around certain types of behavior. Dovetailing on that, we're really invested in the use of restorative approaches within Denver Public Schools, and have been one of the leaders across the nation over the past few years in really implementing restorative approaches, not just as a discipline practice, but really as a universal strategy for schools to utilize to create strong and positive communities, and to address student misconduct when misconduct occurs, so that the harm can be addressed in a way that's less consequence-driven and more rooted in repairing the damage and creating an educational opportunity for both the alleged victim and the alleged perpetrator. What our next step is with restorative approaches, obviously, is to be able to see, are there things that we need to do in a more equitable way so that the use of restorative approaches helps us to push down the rate of African American students who are impacted by suspensions.
Next slide. And we're not going to obviously go through this slide bullet point by bullet point, but we wanted to show you specifically what we mean when we say serious and credible threat. And this is the information that we're sharing with the school leaders and school disciplinarians to recalibrate thinking about there are events that occur around student discipline that are better dealt with through non-exclusionary consequences, and we hope for the day when we have effective interventions for all of these things without students being removed, but we are not at that point right now. We've identified this list as, again, a list that helps us to use some common language with school leaders as we talk about those things that may require an in-school suspension or an out-of-school suspension in order to prepare for that student's more successful participation in school. So we'll just take a minute just to kind of look at the pieces that we're focusing in on right now that we do say are appropriate at this point for this consequence. And do notice what's missing from the list that might have been up here in prior years. You know, that those events that students may be using an inappropriate word in an outburst. You don't find that on this list. We don't see those things as, even though there are certainly behaviors that we don't want students to engage in schools, do not rise to the level of a serious and credible threat within a school. And that's a large shift for many of the folks who are responsible for discipline within schools, understanding the difference between something that is offensive and annoying and maybe disruptive, but is not a serious, incredible threat to that school student body or staff. Next slide. This slide shows that we are adjusting portions of our policy around expulsion to mirror the changes in state statutes. That before we had in our policy a general statement about weapons that included many things that as we look at it, we find that we don't agree that all of those things are necessarily weapons. We've been very clear about toy guns that are obviously toy guns not being included in that. The change in state statutes has helped us to zero in on what a firearm is, as opposed to other types of weapons. And state statute, again, is very clear about what's required, that will have a hearing and a one-year expulsion. And we are fortunate, even within that statute, to have the ability to mitigate that based on the circumstances of that particular student and situation. For example, a student that we find is a very young student who brought a firearm to school, that we are able, through appropriate documentation, to reduce that amount or to not have that be a mandatory consequence for that student. So even within this very clear and strict interpretation of firearm, we are given latitude by the state to use our good judgment and sensible thinking around this issue, and that all other of these weapons issues are that we have discretion around whether they go to an expulsion hearing or not. And then we have, as Dr. Greer mentioned, a very rigorous policy and practice around the students' rights within that expulsion hearing. Next slide. This last slide just shows some of the things that we've been working on, many of us in this room, and Dr. Greer and myself certainly over the summer and into the fall of this year, of looking at our policies, procedures, looking at our data, working with stakeholders within our organization and with our community stakeholders to improve our discipline policy and certainly translate that into more effective practices. And this will culminate, in a sense, with some board action that will revise our discipline policy. And we had a very sophisticated and advanced discipline policy before these revisions. We feel that, again, with the help of our friends from Padres y Jóvenes Unidos and the Advancement Project, as well as a lot of input from other stakeholders in the community and within DPS, we're feeling good about the proposed changes to our discipline policy coming up for review right as we speak even. So that concludes our presentation, and Jason, I believe that we have time now for questions and answers.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, John and Eldridge, for that presentation on what you all are working on in Denver to impact on school discipline for your students. Operator, we are ready now to transition to the Q&A portion of our call.
Thank you. The floor is now open for questions. If you do have a question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time. Questions will be taken in the order they are received. If at any time your question has been answered, you can remove yourself from the queue by pressing 1. If you're using a speakerphone, we ask that while posing your question, you pick up your headset to provide favorable sound quality. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you do have a question or comment, please press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time. Please hold while we poll for questions. Our first question comes from Allison Brown. Allison, please state your question.
Hi. First of all, thank you for this presentation. It's very, very helpful. My question is about the schools that students who are expelled from school in Denver are sent to. what the academic program is at those schools? Are they alternative schools? Are students given a choice about where they go?
Hi, this is Eldridge from Denver. The schools that students are expelled to are all, especially at the high school level, are all degree-granting schools. We do have intensive pathway schools that are schools with smaller populations and more resources and supports, but there are no schools within Denver Public Schools, especially for a high school student, that they cannot graduate from if they elect to stay at that school to complete their education. For our elementary school students and students with disabilities, more than likely those students will end up in serving their expulsion in another similar district-managed school. And specifically for students with disabilities, in a district-managed school that can reasonably meet the IEP needs of the student. So we don't have a mechanism unlike other districts where we refer to an alternative or an expulsion school. We really believe strongly that that any student should be able to receive reasonable educational opportunity, but we realize through the expulsion process that there are some students who need to be removed from their current educational environment because of their behavior within that school.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Anissa Wilfolk. Anissa, please state your question.
Yes, I was interested in knowing what Florida districts they've worked with in the past and if they can share the results of that partnership.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your question.
What Florida districts?
Okay, that question would be for Jason.
Yes. So we are currently active working in Florida. I believe we are in Broward and Duval and other places, and we are actually restarting that partnership with folks there. So I wouldn't be able to share sort of any results right now, but I know that we are looking, similar to our other work, at the code of conducts in those areas and how they could be improved, and sort of sharing some of the best practices that we've learned.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Sandra Glenn. Sandra, please state your question.
Yes, thank you. And again, thank you for the presentation and COSBOX for making this available. And I think my questions are directed to Eldridge, and it's really three parts. Can you give an example of the changes you're making to your teacher, leader, recruiting or induction or professional development deal with the disproportionality in terms of discipline? The second part of that is, how are you involving community leaders to assist you with changing attitudes and perceptions of your school staff? And thirdly, how diverse is your teacher and school leader corps in terms of race or ethnic makeup?
In terms of the training pieces, there are a variety of things that we do within Denver Public Schools to increase the cultural responsiveness of our educators and to create deeper opportunities for our teachers and building leaders to really understand and to understand the equitable opportunities that our students need, but also how to really develop strong and deep relationships, especially across culture, for our students. So one thing that within our organization of the Division of Student Services that we're doing specifically to look at the African American disproportionality is with all of our school psychologists and school social workers. There are about 150 of them in the district. They are all engaged in a collective book study of Pedro Noguera's work, The Trouble with Black Boys, so that they can really understand what are best practice expectations, but also what are the challenges inherent in really providing deep, high-quality nurturance to our African-American students, but also high expectations for African-American students, so that they can bring that information back into their schools and help to leverage on a school-by-school basis the elimination of disproportionality for our students. Within our Office of Post-Secondary Readiness, we do provide opportunities for specific cultural responsiveness training, and we do teacher effectiveness coaching, so bug-in-the-ear type of direct intervention training for our teachers so that in real time with students, they are able to identify and utilize strategies to be more successful with students. A final piece that we do that I'd mention is a very well-received de-escalation training. What we have found in Denver Public Schools is that most of our teachers, through their graduate work, did not really receive training in how to de-escalate situations. And because of that, a very minor situation of that bad experience for 10 seconds can turn into a bad day, a bad month, a bad year in some cases for our kids. So to provide training opportunities for folk to understand how to de-escalate a situation so it doesn't have to result in a removal or a severed relationship between that student, the parent, and the school. Our background in terms of staff, we are a predominantly Anglo population of teachers. We continue to emphasize that all of our staff really require the skills and training to work with a diverse student body, since 80% of our student population are Latino and African American, Native American, and Asian American. But it is a continuing challenge for us to ensure strong best practices for all of our staff and educators, while simultaneously trying to continue to create opportunities for staff of color and other aspects of diversity to come to Denver Public Schools in support of our students. And the third question? The community leaders. One thing we are especially proud of is we have a great Office of Parent and Community Relations that partners with us to be able to reach out to the community to get specific ideas, recommendations, and changes around student discipline. So just in these past few months, we've been reaching out explicitly to the African American community to be able to see what are the pieces from the community's perspective that we need to really focus on, and also so that the communities understand our commitment and goal to eliminate disproportionality. We know that we don't have all of the answers centrally, and for us to be successful in eliminating disproportionality, we need to be able to engage in a very explicit way with not only our formal stakeholders like Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, but also with just general community stakeholders, like pulling together community relations meetings in schools with predominantly African American populations in this case.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you do have a question or comment, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad at this time.
We have a couple of questions that have come in via our chat feature that I'm going to pose to our speakers. The first one is for John and Eldridge in Denver. Were there in-school suspensions also utilized in your district, and what are the percentages, or what does the data look like for those in-school suspensions as compared to out-of-school suspensions?
Thank you. That's a great question, because that's something we track very carefully. We didn't have it included in this presentation, but we recognize that if all we do is transfer out-of-school suspension to in-school suspension, we have not been successful. Now, we did see a couple years ago a little spike in in-school suspensions as we were really examining out-of-school suspension. That did not surprise us, because we had not had the opportunities to provide the training that we have now and the resources that we have now essentially to help schools. So as we were scrutinizing out-of-school suspensions, we did see in-school suspensions go up by a small percentage. Now, over the last couple years, as we have had more robust interventions and support for schools, we've seen both in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension follow similar trends of moving downward.
We have another question that I think is related specifically to the slide that you had about real and credible threats. The question is, have you looked at demographic data related to similar infractions in the adult population? And if so, are there similar efforts in your community to address these adult infractions?
Yeah. Jason, do you have information on that?
I don't, John. I don't.
You know, my response to that is that you know, we, being a school district, are a microcosm of our society in general. We recognize that this disproportionality exists within the community, within the criminal justice system. We know our mission here to eliminate, as Jason mentioned earlier, that school-to-jail pipeline, to eliminate the criminalization of behaviors that are more just part of being a child and adolescent, and not a part of the criminal justice system, to make those distinctions. So that's where we focus our efforts, but recognize that we're operating in an environment of disproportionality within our society. And I wish I could say that Colorado was a leader in the elimination of disproportionality within our criminal justice system. That's not my perception right now.
Okay. We have another question. What kinds of restorative alternatives have you found to be effective at the elementary level? And then I'll add, can you also speak specifically to older students or the high school level as well?
So the restorative approaches we feel work throughout early childhood education all the way through grade 12. What needs to be modified somewhat is how much of it is verbally mediated, as opposed to using other types of strategies to allow for the student who is the alleged instigator of the behavior to understand the impact of his or her behavior, to be able to accept the responsibility for his or her behavior, and for skillful facilitation of the community around what are the things that need to be done to repair the harm. So we don't think of restorative approaches typically, or restorative justice particularly, as the student needs to do something, as opposed to a conversation on what needs to be done to really repair the relationship, and how does that student really use the experience to have empathy for how his or her behavior impacted other individuals. We find that in very rare circumstances where it would probably not be appropriate to use restorative approaches, say in a bullying situation where you have clear power issues that don't lend themselves to a restorative approach, that schools that utilize a structure of restorative approaches are able to manage a wide degree of student misbehavior in ways that historically they would have had to do through an out-of-school suspension. The other thing that we find that restorative approaches affords us is greater parent and community involvement when done really well. That parent and community members can participate in restorative circles, can be involved in addressing the harm done in terms of how it impacts the school and the community, instead of being sometimes focused from more of a criminal justice perspective on the individual student needs to be punished to be able to address the behavior.
And I would also add on that note that going back to from my presentation when we were looking at the 25 different alternatives to suspensions, expulsions, and arrests, that sometimes folks are focused on restorative approaches or restorative justice, but looking at some of the things listed on there about just maybe sending a reminder or reteaching expectations and skills or losing privileges or role play, a written apology, a timeout or chill out period, a reflective essay. These are the type of ways that we need to think about discipline, particularly for younger students, because these we know are effective when dealing with younger students, and there's no need to resort to some of the more extreme and harsh measures that we've seen when dealing with specific behaviors, where the types of things I just mentioned would be just as, if not more effective in dealing with what's going on. So it's just something that we always encourage districts across the country we work with to think about when writing their discipline codes and thinking about how to administer discipline in their schools.
In your presentation, you mentioned 5-7 strategies in an alternative suspension document that's used in Denver. Could you perhaps describe some of those strategies that are utilized in that document?
Well, the strategies are unique to the specific behaviors, so it would be challenging for me. We have probably about 35 different behaviors. But to give you kind of a snapshot overview, say with arson, for instance, in the past, a student might end up burning his or her homework outside of the building somewhere. That might have resulted in a 5-day suspension. The alternatives piece would be first to investigate, is there a need for an in-school intervention or out-of-school planning to ensure that the school and the community are safe? In that type of circumstance, probably not, because the incident has been managed. So there's not a need for an out-of-school suspension. Then you would go to, one strategy would be in our district, enlisting the Denver Fire Department program around arson-related behavior, so that there's an educative piece that occurs. We would be using a restorative approach so that the individual understands the potential harm that could have been done, and that the community is able to respond and figure out what are ways that we need to manage to repair the harm. It would be to use a more interventionist strategy. So in the short term, to periodically check the student for a lighter, using more common sense strategies to ensure that the behavior doesn't happen again. What we've seen and what I think national research clearly demonstrates is removing that student from school, say for 3 to 5 days, does not change the potential behavior. If anything, it makes it more likely that misconduct is going to happen because of the severing of the relationship between the student, the family, and the school. Within Denver Public Schools, if we saw that out-of-school suspension was a strategy that worked for most of to change student misconduct, we actually would advocate for that as a piece in our toolbox. By our looking at our data in the way we do, we see that that's not the case. So that's one of the reasons we really are working on educating our building leaders on the use of alternative structures for discipline as opposed to out-of-school suspension. But what we can do once it is finalized, and probably through Jason, we can share this document with you so that you can see how the comprehensive way that we're trying to think about alternatives to suspension in a way that really helps school leaders have something in their toolbox instead of us telling them you just shouldn't suspend students.
Thank you. We appear to have another question from Derek Elon. Derek, please state your question. Derek, your line is now live.
Hello? Hello?
Hello, yes, did you have a question?
Yes, we want to know, from the 25 strategies, which one was the most effective and which one was the least out of the 25?
Yeah, thanks for your question. It's very difficult to answer that question specifically because this list of different behaviors, it depends on what's happened. So obviously if there's been a fight with some injuries that have occurred, like perhaps that requires more intervention than just a reminder or a redirection. Depends also, I think, on the age of the students and the setting and all of that. That's what's happened. I think this slide is just something that we designed to show folks that to think about discipline in a different way, that there are commonsensical approaches that one can take depending on the situation that don't require teachers and administrators and school staff to resort to the harsh effects of suspensions, expulsions, and arrests. And obviously another important thing about the 25 strategies I talked about is some are free, some are easy to implement, some cost more money. One of the things listed on there is referral to community-based services. In some communities, there may not be those type of services, or a referral to those services would just do further injustice to the student and what's available to them. So I think I don't know if I can answer your question specifically, but I just want to talk about how the slide is designed to give you ideas about what might work, for you all to think about discipline in a different way, such that it includes this more sort of humane treatment of harsh discipline and of behaviors, and to think about incorporating these strategies into your daily schools if possible.
Thank you. There are no further questions at this time.
We have a couple of questions that have come in, again, on the chat. We have one question. Is there a designated school staff member who is responsible for coordinating all of these alternatives to suspensions and expulsions in your district?
Yes, there is. In terms of expulsions, I hold the expulsion authority for the district as delegated to me from the school board to the superintendent, and from the superintendent to me as the executive director of student services. So I have general oversight on the expulsion process and to a certain degree over the suspension process also, in terms of our policy limits of 0 to 3 days, and that students who would be suspended longer than that need to make a request to me for that ability. So, and then Dr. Greer holds a particular responsibility within the district in terms of his supervision of the outreach support, the expulsion process, all of those pieces. So I would say that between the two of us, we are the whatever title you'd want to give it, the head disciplinarians of our school district.
Okay. Another question that's come in on the chat is, have you encountered resistance to the restorative and responsive approaches as not being strict enough or potentially in conflict with or too different from how behavior is addressed at home? If so, how do you address that?
Yeah, and certainly it is, as with any new thought, new approach, there are people that embrace it and understand what we're promoting. There are people that are not as accepting, and certainly part of it has to do with just that worldview I talked about earlier of the worldview of crime and punishment versus the worldview of behavior and education and intervention. So we have encountered resistance both internally and within the community, just to be honest, that we are pretty constantly reminding folks that we do not stand for a reduction in the standard of behavior within our school. What we're about is high standards of behavior in our school and effective methods of intervention. And so, as Dr. Greer mentioned, if out-of-school suspension worked, we would be all over it, and it'd be very simple to teach people how to do out-of-school suspension. We don't find that in most cases to be the most effective intervention for student behavior, and that we are working on educating a lot of folks about our perspective on this. And we feel very passionate that we have the right 21st century attitude and the only attitude that's going to eliminate disproportionality. If we continue with the practices of the past, we will get the results of the past, which will be disproportionate outcomes for our students of color.
We have a couple more questions. We'll try to fit in as many as possible. Another question that came in is, how important is student engagement with the curriculum and instruction in preventing misbehavior?
Absolutely essential. And that's one of the reasons why we invest a lot of time and energy around cultural responsive pedagogy, so that we help ensure that teachers have the tools to really engage in that high expectations around academic success, but also the high nurturance. Our students need both of those pieces to be in evidence from their teachers to be able to be successful. When that relationship is breached, we often see, and national research will support this as well, that's when you usually see challenges around behavior escalating and the difficulty of a school to be able to reasonably address that behavior. So absolutely the core for all success is, do we teach students well? And what we clearly know is the only way students are going to learn is if they're in school. The only way that we can guarantee that students aren't going to learn is when we do removals, because what most students will be doing on those 3 to 5 or 10 days of being out of school is not cracking their algebra book. They're going to be turning on the TV to watch SpongeBob.
And I think it's also, I get this question all the time, and, that there is a very strong interlink between the two, and it's also important to think about why applying consistent disciplinary practices are important, because a lot of national research has shown where students, a student of color and a white student have the same behavior but are treated differently on that behavior. Students are very keenly aware that that is happening, and that, especially students of color, are treated more harshly, and that forces or causes students of color to become disengaged and to have an attitude and to not want to be part of a positive school culture because they see that happening to them, and they feel like they're targeted because of that, and as a result they do disengage, and it's completely related to outcomes and successes in your schools. Is that when there is that inconsistency and when it's not sensible, then these are the type of reactions that students have, and I think we can all agree that these are the reactions that students should not be having in a school setting.
And I'll put out one last question for our speakers. What support services and resources are in place in your schools? For example, what is the role of the social workers in the school? Do they provide one-on-one counseling or group counseling, or do you use coaches to help students navigate the challenges they may face behaviorally?
So in Denver Public Schools, we do have in every building school psychologists, school nurses, and school social workers, and then in all of our high schools and some of our middle schools, also school counselors. All of those individuals provide individualized support, not only to the students, but also support to families and community members as appropriate. We also, within Denver, have strong partnerships with our medical colleagues in terms of having school-based health clinics that provide comprehensive physical as well as mental health supports in a variety of our schools, and other resources for students. But I would urge that individual support is not sufficient to change the overall systems issues that result in African American students, in this case, being chronically and systematically overrepresented in discipline events. It is essential for that individual student who may be struggling with the breach of the relationship between him or herself and the school, but for districts to eliminate disproportionality, it takes a multi-pronged approach and a willingness, as we're seeing in Denver, to truly address that what has happened over the past several decades should not happen anymore. And that is changing the hearts and minds of individuals, as John said. It's addressing policy to ensure that policy is in place that doesn't lead to disproportionate outcomes. It's providing training. It's ensuring that the community understands the implications of it. So both that systems level and that cultural change is just as critical as how do we help that individual student navigate through the challenges of a system that might be unfairly targeting him or her because of issues of ethnicity and race instead of issues of actual misconduct.
Thank you. I want to thank the Advancement Project and Denver Public Schools for their presentations today, and all of you participants for your insightful questions. It's hope that the presentation today is a springboard for discussion in your individual communities about what can be done to improve school discipline policies and practices, particularly as it impacts boys of color. Our presentation materials and the recording of this webinar will be available on the CLERC website in the next few days. Please feel free to share these resources with colleagues who may have been unable to participate today. We'll be sending out an email with a link to an innovation survey, and we ask that you take a few minutes to provide us with feedback about today's session. Be on the lookout for upcoming webinar announcements in the new year, and consider becoming a member of COSBOC to take advantage of the webinars and other benefits. We thank you for taking time to participate today.